and above all violence on the other. The ruling white interests were bent on denying black people access to the modes and means of urbanization, justifying their actions on racialized colonial binaries that condemned black people to a primitive caste unable to fully transition into westernized modernity. This slightly Afro-pessimist and dark introduction of 20th century black urbanization in South Africa is aimed at providing the backdrop upon which to engage Ubuntu. How then could Ubuntu be performed in an urban paradigm that itself had not accorded any Ubuntu or humanity to the urban-based black populace? To problematize the notion of Ubuntu as paradigmatic of African exceptionalism, I return to the words of Mainganyi, who, among other observations, made the profound claim that within urban spaces, and I quote, "there is no such thing as African nature," end quote. In other words, Mainganyi dispelled the existence of a unique African personality or Africanness, stressing instead that urban-based black constituents had, throughout the 20th century, developed transgressive, sophisticated, and highly adaptational lifestyles. If we accept that there is no such thing as African nature within the urban space, how then did Ubuntu, this so-called African worldview, feature, if at all, within the intensely bigoted South African cities of the previous century? Was it even possible for an Ubuntu sensibility to exist in manufactured black urbanisms or townships, where the monstrosities of crime, rape, alcoholism, and poverty prevailed? The point of this melancholic description of 20th century urbanization in South Africa, and to answer the aforementioned questions, is that the uneven texture, as Richard Marbeck puts it, of South African cities during the 20th century were, and I quote him, were where Ubuntu draws most force. Put differently, the very existence of Ubuntu is validated in situations of duress, inequality, unfairness, and unease, as was the case with black urbanization in colonial and apartheid South Africa. That is to say that the legitimacy of Ubuntu is best tested in scenarios where a high density of people coexist, which in the modern world is the metropolitan city, and where their subjectivities are compelled to abrasively rub off against each other. I will now move on to a performative definition of Ubuntu. Ubuntu has been christened as a distinct and totalizing theory of being African. Scholars, activists, politicians, capitalists, theologians, and dare say even criminals over have trumpeted the redemptive and instrumental power of Ubuntu to transform society and cure humanity of its inhumanity. Among the infinite applications of Ubuntu, there are those who revel in the forgiveness potency of the philosophy, or its place in business, or its potential for reforming education, or even making criminality more humane. Others highlight its ethical and moral propensity. But what is undeniable is that Ubuntu is Africa's gift to the world. While acknowledging the venerated place of Ubuntu in African epistemologies, David MacDonald is fearful that the prevailing language and practice of Ubuntu and its hyper-celebration as being prototypically African is too compromised by market ideology and discourse. In other words, there's been a kind of repetitive flattening and overt schematization of the term to the degree that it risks losing its material impact. In this paper, I focus on the performative manifestation of Ubuntu and not so much on its rhetoric. But before proposing a performative definition of Ubuntu, I must add that Ubuntu mania is also an offshoot of what Felwine Sarr calls Afrotopia, the post-colonial imperative for Africans to reformulate their own desired pasts, presents, and futures. To this end, radical thinkers like Dennis Ekpo, who coined post-Africanism, is of the persuasion that Ubuntu, in its African rootedness, is not a progress-prone ideology. Ekpo almost blasphemously pronounces Ubuntu as the torchbearer of African exceptionalism. Okay, let me repeat. Ekpo almost blasphemously pronounces that Ubuntu, as the torchbearer of African exceptionalism, is not a globally competitive worldview and has done very little to insert Africa into the theater of world politics, economics, trade, scientific innovation, and cultural expression in terms that upgrade the material conditions of Africans. For Ekpo, Ubuntu mania is essentially a product of Afrophilia, the unshakable love for all things African, and anti-colonial drives that seek to reassert Africa's unique place in the world. In other words, Ubuntu is part of the colonial dialectic in that it positions Africa as being different from the rest, or specifically the West. Emmanuel Eze reasons in a similar trajectory and feels that the expectations placed on Ubuntu are contradictorily and simultaneously too much and not enough, in the sense that Ubuntu has been unable to realize the ideal Africa. Paralleling Ubuntu with negritude, Eze posits that Ubuntu, and I quote, succeeds as a kind of aestheticized, quasi-religious political thought for a particular place and time, end quote. In other words, echoing Ekpo, Ubuntu should be seen as an expedient thought system that was useful in servicing and upholding the Afrocentric and decolonization projects of the mid-20th century. While I resonate with some of these criticisms of the utopianization of Ubuntu, this paper is my own attempt to redeem Ubuntu from the realm of rhetorical abstraction by ascribing it to a place, space, and object. I'm interested not so much in the meaning of Ubuntu, but more so in the performative manifestation of Ubuntu, or rather the practice of Ubuntu, and how this practice has been aestheticized by Black artists in South Africa throughout the previous century. To achieve this performative definition, I turn to the work of Gabriel Setiloane and his seminal African Theology and Introduction text, which theorizes Ubuntu as a theological system of being African. Although Setiloane does not use the term Ubuntu throughout his text, his ideas are a salient and instructive crystallization of Ubuntu and its potential aesthetics. In a chapter titled Ubuntu, on being a person, Setiloane defines African personhood in terms that point towards a functional understanding of Ubuntu. He traces the roots of Ubuntu, to, and I quote, the divine, the sacred, weird, holy, all qualities of divinity. But beyond being spirit or siriti and transcendental, Mutu or Ubuntu comes into existence through relationship. As he explains, and I quote, the essence of being is participation, in which humans are always interlocked with one another. The human being is not only vital force, but more vital force in participation, end quote. Ubuntu, therefore, is the performative expression or active verb of being Mutu, a human being. To be human and to coexist with other humans, objects, and nature is itself Ubuntu. In reductive terms, to be alive is to be automatically bound to the forces and logic of Ubuntu. This conception of Ubuntu is significant because it has vested interest in how Mutu was visualized in cultural artifacts, that's Setiloane specifically. He critiques how Siriti, or the divine aura of Mutu, has been depicted and considers it for that, and I quote, when artists attempted to capture this phenomenon, they have restricted it to a silly shining little ring around the head of the object, end quote. Here, Sidogi was of course referencing traditional Christian paintings from the European art canon. For Sidogi, these artworks, which represented the divine and saintly amongst humanity through halos and rays of light, were weak representations of the vital force that drives human interaction. While there is definite artistic merit in the trope of Christianized artworks, I tend to agree with his assessment. A vast majority of Western religious images are void of the participation or performative dimension of Ubuntu or humanity. In Sidogi's final analysis, the power, and I quote, radiance of Sireti, or the spirit, exudes itself through the whole. Also adding that Sireti is relational and enters communication with Diriti, plural, of other humans and objects. I will now move to the part of musealization. Before moving to a discussion of select examples that point to Ubuntu aesthetics, it is necessary to caution against the potential ossification of Ubuntu by linking it to cultural objects like art. While this paper, and indeed the Ubuntu Dialogues project, engages with the relevance of museums as guardians of the cultural health of modern civilization, we need to guard against the musealization of Ubuntu. The notion of musealization was popularized by Andreas Huyssen, who wrote about the rush to memorialize the everyday post the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany. For Huyssen, this wave of museum mania signaled a resistance against the planned obsolescence of consumer society that had been unleashed across European society towards the end of the 20th century. Musealization, as Huyssen expresses, was the institutionalized, and I quote, obsession with memory in contemporary culture. To, end quote, to musealize is to arrest the performative and functional power of objects by confining them to preserved spaces within the museum glass cabinet. As Michel Baizai reveals, musealization, and I quote, is an act invested in the positive undertones as it saves the items from utilitarian exploitation, end quote. This desire to save objects from utilitarian exploitation is in effect an act of canonization, because what is preserved in the museum is centered as prestigious, exceptional, and transcendental. While I support the musealization of African heritage and cultural praxis, it should not come at the expense of reducing the utilitarian potency of the very objects that are being canonized. The danger implicit in Ubuntu mania is the confinement of Ubuntu not only to the realm of ideological rhetoric, but with cultural projects such as the artworks discussed here. Ubuntu risks being condemned to the museum prison, stored away in the halls of history. We need to be wary of limiting Ubuntu and its aesthetics to museum fossilization. The main proposition I am making here is that works of art produced by black artists during the previous centuries were not only meant for museum and gallery walls, but were meant to engage and to aestheticize the humanity or Ubuntu of black subjectivity, and more importantly, reframing 20th century black art as aestheticizations of Ubuntu among black societies is an overdue reordering of the standard Western configuration of humanity. I will pass this section of why aesthetics, and we'll leave that over to the question and answer section, because I think it is an important question as to why an aesthetics of Ubuntu. But I would like to move on to the actual discussion of the artwork because I find that more interesting. Black artists, also subject to race-based urban subjugation, were among the most silent translators and capturers of 20th century urban life and its contradictions. What then was the nature and stylistic rendering thereof of an urban-based Ubuntu when we factor in that black people had to, and here I appropriate the words of the late pro wrestler Eddie Guerrero, lie, cheat, and steal in order to navigate the urban maze. I have already contended that the problematic urban context during 20th century South Africa was prime for the performance of Ubuntu. My position in this last section of the paper is that black artists who pictured this expression of Ubuntu or humanity were themselves creating an art of Ubuntu. I commence by looking at examples of mother and child images. This is one of the most dominant tropes in 20th century black art. The mother embracing the infant is of course a recurring theme throughout the history of art, especially the classical European painting tradition, where reproductions of the Madonna and infant are ubiquitous. Within the context of 20th century South Africa, however, the representation of the mother and child was undergirded by exceptional circumstances not necessarily linked to religion or mythology. The urban black family unit in the 20th century was characterized by a perpetual state of instability. In Vinoni, for example, one of the cities one of the towns within the Gauteng region, during 1949, 73% of babies born in 1949 were out of wedlock. Amidst other factors, single-parent families and premarital pregnancy was also an offshoot of the high levels of rape brought about by Tsotsiden within black urbanisms. Women who lived alone without the presence of a male figure within the urban setting were highly vulnerable to sexual crimes. Thus, the obsession of black art, the obsession black artists had with representing the mother and child has to be seen within the social realities. The supremely talented Julian Mutov, whose image you are seeing now, spent most of his short stint as an artist portraying the mother and child. In A Mother's Comfort, Mutov uses his signature dark and bold lines to exude the compassion and care black mothers provided for their children. Even in the most difficult circumstances, commenting on the mystical connection between mother and child, Pumla Hoboda Madigizela evokes the term of inimba, and I quote, to describe the bodily sign of empathy, which can be interpreted to mean the feeling of motherhood, end quote. In a similar vein, the thick lines that move along the contours of the mother and baby in Moto's drawings are an artistic rendering of inimba, which visually conjoins the mother to her offspring and vice versa. Thus, the artwork becomes the embodiment of the link betwixt the mother's humanity or serenity and that of the child, which is the prototypical realization of Ubuntu at a micro and intimate level. Hobodo Madigizela poetically characterizes such intimate forms of Ubuntu as, and I quote, the expression of empathy through the body. Without doubt, the most intrinsic manifestations of Ubuntu among black communities in South Africa involved female agency and care. To this end, black women of the 20th century need to be accorded due adulation for the strength and grace they displayed in holding families together. For the most part, even in the face of government restrictions and rampant urban-based violence perpetrated against them, black women relocated to the urban areas on their own volition throughout the century. Untitled by Duran Sihlani is a somber reminder of the precarious and often lonely nights that black females and their children endured together. The candle at the center of the composition, which illuminates the thick impasto painting, signifies the hope that lived black households during recurrent moments of strife and loneliness. Here Sihlani produced what Colin Richards and Sandra Klopper term a type of history painting, wherein he crystallized into a single frame the complexities of everyday urban existence for black women during the difficult 60s and 70s. But more than this, Sihlani's painting is a sincere illustration of how Ubuntu played out in the daily lives of women and children who had no access to basic urban services such as electricity, tarred roads, running water, and the like. Although many black communities throughout the 20th century were decapitated through the inhumane migrant labor regime and lack of adequate housing, which compelled black men to a perpetual nomadic status, black families still endured. Eric Mbata's family is a pastel drawing of a black family comprised of 3 children being embraced by their mother. The fact that this artwork is titled Family, but is void of the father, underscores how the family unit among black communities was impacted, but not ultimately undone by the absence of the father. In this drawing, the various individuals of the family are brought together harmoniously through overlapping lines and textured coloring that move interchangeably across the figures and the backdrop. Jacob Damini, who wrote a fascinating text titled Native Nostalgia, claims that although black suffering was a large part of the colonial and apartheid experience, black people, and more to the point, black families, still lived what can be categorized as beautiful, normal lives, as illustrated in this artwork. Besides illustrating the intimate expressions of Ubuntu, artists also engage with the collective humanity of black life, as seen in Peter Clarke's Sunset at Windermere, Africa Maibubi. This gouache painting is an important recording of spaces that were dismantled on the basis of the segregated spatial policies of the apartheid government. As part of the Group Areas Act of 1950, which was building on various other acts that came before, urban suburbs where blacks resided, like among many others, Windermere in Cape Town, which Clarke engages with in this work, were destroyed as part of the whiteification of South African cities. Clarke's artwork is a rendition of the erstwhile mixed-race ghetto of Windermere from the perspective of an insider. Whilst Peter Clarke, a colored artist, was not a resident of Windermere himself, he possessed a lived connection with his counterparts from such spaces who, like himself, were ravaged by apartheid. This intimate and highly illustrative painting of 3 men engaged in the very private act of relieving themselves is, to echo the words of R.T. Georgia, a journalistic snapshot of the monotony of racial oppression. Yet, conversely, it is an aesthetic reminder of the liveliness and beauty that existed in the rubble of this racist oppression. It was by no mistake that Clarke decided to paint the sunset of Windermere as opposed to its gloom, which certainly also existed. Clarke redeems the humanity of these men who were forced to use pit toilets that did not accord them any privacy or dignity. Clarke's artwork is an artistic restoration of their pride and their siriti, their humanity, hence becoming an aesthetic of Ubuntu. Clarke's creative career was itself dedicated to representations of the livelihoods of colored folk. As Christina Sharp reminds us, the dominant narrative of coloreds in South Africa produced by white intellectuals rendered them as, and I quote, figures of monstrosity, their presence an indicator of national disease, end quote. Clark's body of work, and this painting specifically, sought to undo these dehumanizing and racist views. An aesthetic of Ubuntu was also palpable in cityscape interpretations of black urbanisms. An example that captures the imagination is David Mokgano's Old Pineville Township. This watercolor image is emblematic of counter-artistic narratives that were determined to visualize urban spaces where black people resided as idyllic, livable, and above all, humane zones. Although produced in 1993, Mokgano's painting is an imaginative re-illustration of Pineville during its golden era of the 1930s and 40s. During the 1950s, there were repeated attempts to relocate the black residents of Pineville to the newly formed Orlando Township, as Pineville fell on land reserved for occupation by white people. Sadly, like many other townships, black townships, Pineville was poorly administered by the white authorities. The area was deprived of basic services, which was a calculated attempt to reverse black urbanization by making urban life as difficult as possible for black residents. Mokgano's painting is a polished vision of a typical day in Pineville, which challenges the dominant pictures of black urbanism during the 1950s, as seen in photographs by, for example, Martin West, where the maldevelopment, non-service delivery, and squalor of the township was highlighted. Mokgano's painting aestheticizes these troubling realities by giving Pineville the aura of normality and humanity. A performative Ubuntu is also palpable throughout Mokgano's composition, with several renditions of lovers in warm embraces, children playing together, and neighbors in conversation, and neighbors conversing with each other. Besides the formal and aesthetic qualities of the work, it also serves as a reimagined historical record of early black urbanisms from the viewpoint of a black artist. Old Pineville was as important as the erstwhile and iconic Sophiatown because it was a space where many black people first experienced the urban environment during the 1900s. That is the urban environment in Johannesburg. In many ways, the juxtaposition between Mokgano's Ubuntu aesthetic of Pineville and West's accurate photo documentation of the space underlines the importance of revisiting 20th century black urbanisms through the lenses of Ubuntu and the aesthetics thereof, and also through the art produced by black artists specifically. Failing to do so privileges the monotone picture of black urbanization and black subjectivity as being non-human. The last artwork I turn to is potentially the most unexpected signifier of Ubuntu. At the core of my interpretation of this image is the pervasiveness of crime in 20th century black urbanisms. One of the first internal questions I struggled to reconcile when thinking through the existence of Ubuntu in 20th century black urbanisms was how Ubuntu could survive within a context where black-on-black crime was so rampant and unchecked. Although I have made a case for how such troubled contexts are an ideal playground for a performative manifestation of Ubuntu, the question remains how to justify the notion of humanity or Ubuntu when there were forces that actively dehumanized other individuals through crime, violence, and exploitation. Please note that the inhumanity of slavery, colonization, and apartheid system does not concern me so much as the inhumanity perpetrated by blacks on other black bodies. It is well documented that white authorities throughout the 20th century had no interest in safeguarding or protecting innocent black urban dwellers from criminal elements. The main site of black-on-black violence was without exception the black female body. In the words of Pumlakola, and I quote, "Nothing about apartheid made black women feel valued or taken seriously," end quote. Clive Glazer corroborates by noting how criminal gangs in black urbanisms performed a dangerous and particularly aggressive form of masculinity, and how this resulted in the rape and exploitation of black women in unfathomable proportions. My sense is that the violence enacted by black youths to their own kin were ill-directed outbursts against a white government that had deprived them of decent education, fair-paying jobs, and most significantly, their sense of place and being. Also, these acts of violence against law-abiding members of the black community was seen as just retribution and a wake-up call to those who had conformed to the system and tacitly contributed to an inherently violent and racist regime. Thus, criminal gangs in black locations were two-faced protagonists and antagonists. On the one end, there were purveyors of anti-apartheid law and black agency, whilst on the other, there were the chief terrorizers, only surpassed by the state, of the same black constituents they embodied. How then does this criminality unsettle the persistence of Ubuntu among black Africans, especially on the backdrop of Ubuntu being branded as a uniquely African contribution to the world? For me, the answer comes not from thinking about Ubuntu as being prototypically African. The existence of black-on-black crime within formative black urban communities confirms that Ubuntu is not a preset condition for being African. It shows that Ubuntu, or humanity, is an act, a deed that one accords to another through goodwill. Unfortunately, this act of Ubuntu can also be subverted and bastardized, wherein one individual takes away the humanity of another through, for example, criminality. Untitled by Keith Sibiya is a rare artistic snapshot of the pervasiveness of crime during the 1950s. It is also a representation of how Mutu can be stripped of their seriti, their humanity. This highly emotive pastel drawing displays the head of a man smoking a pipe, and his eyes have been erased to conceal his personhood. The figure has a bandana tied to his forehead in a manner that was appropriated by gang culture in the prisons and streets of major westernized cities around the world. Yet the portrait is not overtly that of a criminal. For another equally valid interpretation could argue this image as a depiction of an anonymous young black male smoking a pipe. However, the fact that the person could be anyone, but is in effect nobody, accentuates how criminal culture of the 20th century was made up of hordes of ill-fated young black men who fell victim to limited opportunity and shattered hopes within racialized South African cities. But most significantly, the fact that the figure has been partially defaced speaks of how criminality destroyed the Ubuntu, or humanity, of both the victims and the perpetrators. In other words, by denying and stealing the humanity of others, the would-be criminal in this composition has subsequently forfeited his own humanity. Sibiya aestheticizes this disavowal of the criminal's Ubuntu, or Siriti, through the erasure of his eyes, the metaphorical removal of the window to his soul. By doing this, Sibiya was himself performing an aesthetics of Ubuntu, by symbolically restoring the dignity of those who had been affected by criminality through the removal of the Ubuntu or Siriti of the perpetrator. In conclusion, my bold claim in this paper is that 20th century urban black life and the representations thereof can be described as the golden age of a modern performance of Ubuntu. That said, my desire was not to present another apologist interpretation of Ubuntu exceptionalism and its place in African epistemology. Rather, I sought to explicate how Ubuntu, as a philosophy of being, was evident in the multidimensional, complex, and often inhumane context of 20th century urban-based life in South Africa. Black artists, but this argument can be extended to black creatives generally, but black artists who portrayed formative black life were themselves imagining and fashioning an aesthetics of Ubuntu through their artistic recordings of these moments. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
I think we should just stay
there.
there.
Okay.
And I think we can open up the floor to questions. I'm not sure we even need to have me here as a moderator, but...
I just wondered if we could go back to the wonderful Sihale picture, which is
Durant.
in contrast.
Yeah.
So, because it's such a fantastic, I mean, I love reading the paper, but it was wonderful seeing the images as well.
Yeah.
But it occurred to me, you know, that the symbolism of the mirror, but both in townships and in prison spaces, is really foundational of much of the art and poetry you're talking about. So I was thinking in Jeremy Cronin's poem, in Setswana, right, Moto, right, a person is a person because of another person.
That's right.
Right, which is sort of the foundational, one of the foundational texts of what becomes Ubuntu poetics. Right, it's a prison scene in which the prisoner and the two prisoners are communicating through a mirror. Right? They don't have the possibility of direct exchange, but they're able through the symbolism of the mirror to establish solidarity and eventually the clenched black fist that extends humanity in the face of the Africana, of the border. And we were speaking of before Mapansula, the great film of the 80s, right, in which the prison becomes a space not just of course of the emasculation, as you said, but also the rebirth by repositioning our anti-hero in a world of women through divination in which there are a lot of mirrors, in which the mirror becomes the space and the throne water becomes the space that connects the living and the ancestors. So I'm so interested that what Sahali is doing here around that candle, right, and what looks to be a place of great precarity, and yet there's a sense of the infinite, because to light a candle is to connect oneself to multiple generations through the mirror, and so that there's a sense almost as we go to infinity towards the furthest light, which might be the light of the ancestors themselves. So even here, through the miracle of the artist, lineage is not lost, and there's some connection with exchanges that the system can never quite destroy. So if we go forward then to that wonderful pencil piece, a few ones forward, right, maybe two forward, by, one more. Yeah. I mean, it's just interesting, isn't it, that the central image of the porch itself, which some woman has carefully polished again and again, is also reflective.
Yeah, it is reflective.
That sense of openness and expansion, and that aesthetics of everyday life that links us to another world, even here. You know, you might not be physically in the Transkei or the Transvaal or wherever it is, but that connection to something else that is beyond still lives on, and that's beautifully expressed in this art.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reading. I couldn't agree with you more. I think especially in this work, when we think of what Sitoloane mentions about Siriti as being the divine, right, the spiritual, and that is contingent of the human, that we cannot think of the human outside of the divine. Certainly one can bring that reading.
The next one, because even there too, I mean, yes, there's no, as you say, no senior male figure, but one wonders, you know, for so many South African artists, there's a tendency to evoke ancestral presences of the shades not by specific representation, but by some concentration of energy? And is there a sense that what's protecting the female-dominated family is some presence that's still there? I'm so interested in that play of color around her head on both sides.
Yeah. And going back to your point about the prisons, I actually have a little bit more imagery, which I don't engage with in the paper. Where again, if you think of the prison population in the 20th century, that most of the anti-heroes that you find in the prisons were in fact not overt criminals, right? I mean, the prisons were, and sometimes it used to be a political strategy as well, but were populated by people, just basic pass offenses, right? Just because you did not have your quote-unquote visa in the urban space, then you would be taken to prison. And so how does that kind of engage with our thinking of criminality and what it meant to be a criminal in the 20th century urban space specifically.
So for that reason, liberation art so often depicts the prison as the metaphor for the entire nation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating exposition of the concept of Ubuntu. I think you did a great job by taking the concept of performance to explicate this, and also to separate it from the criticism that a mere valorization of Ubuntu might end up essentializing it or emphasizing the exceptional argument. I have 2 points. One is something else that might help in the project of walking away from the label of essentialism or exceptionalism is the fact that the idea of Ubuntu, I think, is not necessarily unique to Africa. I think that liberates it from the kind of straitjacket of people saying, hey, this is our thing, and it's African. We Africans are the creators of Ubuntu. Because indeed, in other cultures, you see similar ideas about family and community, and I think the point that Ubuntu brings today is that these are things that are essentially humane, not just human, but humane, that we should be supporting and raising and highlighting about the human existence. So some examples from other parts of the world I think would help in that project. My other point has to do with gender. It appears to me that most of the artists here are male. And I wondered about how this Ubuntu concept is depicted or performed, to use your terminology, by women. Do we have women artists, and what worldview are they showing us?
So to your second point, yes, there are female artists, and that is a shortcoming of this presentation. I think I should have provided a more balanced bouquet of kind of what was represented by 20th century black artists. But yes, there were female artists, and now that you mention it, I think that there are some interesting dynamics at play in how the females kind of engaged with 20th century life versus the male artists, right? Just thinking top of my head some of the examples that I'm picturing now. But yes, I think it will be instructive moving forward to include those. And I agree with you certainly on your first point that this valorization of Ubuntu as being prototypically African is a major challenge. However, as I noted, if one reads it from a particular kind of historical standpoint, then you can understand why it was framed in those ways, especially as a kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial project, then Africans had to kind of assert themselves as being very different from the West, specifically. So in that sense, yes, Ubuntu kind of worked, and these are some of the critiques, like Dennis Ekpo says, but look, yes, 1950s, 60s, and so on, 20th century Ubuntu, we can understand that it was expedient for that moment, but right now it's not really helping Africa in a material sense to continue to say this is something that we have invented, and you said it's a human issue.
I had something to say along the lines of what is said. The first point about Ubuntu not being an African concept or principle. It's not necessarily the case either. It could be. You have the same thing in different cultures, but represented out or acted out differently. So, and in that case, maybe you don't need to take the principle elsewhere to another community or culture which is not African to strengthen your case. So you can still deal with it the way you have it. Based in Africa, the word is African. They want Bantu languages. So the label is very important. And even the principles related to that entity, the label and the label. So if it happens that such things are found in other places outside of Africa, that's okay. But still you can have your argument, your expositions based on Ubuntu Africa, and you're good to go. Nothing I wanted to add to my own question or comment. Maybe, is this part of your acceptation?
Okay, yeah, so this is a really small part of a larger project that looks at 20th century.
My interest have been what are some of the changes, the artistic visual art representation of the themes of within Ubuntu over time. Any changes, and what do we generally come up with? What are the themes and what are the interpretations? And what are the messages, even in times of history, and what could have been influenced because things change, directions change. The artists themselves, whether they didn't have to think about this, they didn't have the abilities to expose some of these themes. It would be very interesting thing to know the historical patterns.
That's right, and I mean the performance, if you think of the performative aspect of Ubuntu, is still very much an ongoing, living thing, and one does not want to confine it to kind of as just a historical moment. So yes, artists are still engaging in representing.
Because you get like themes like.
That's right, the mother and child trope, yeah.
How it does family, how is it depicted? Historically.
So whereas this project is confined to kind of the 20th century, certainly, I think there is a whole repository, amazing repository of contemporary engagements with. I mean, I would extend it beyond kind of urban black life, but urban black life generally in South Africa, and within that one can extrapolate this sense of kind of an Ubuntu aesthetic that is taking place. I mean, one of the most amazing feedback that I received was from Pumla when I gave this kind of initial talk, where she said that in many ways what one needs to engage with is how the artists in creating the work are in effect kind of embodying, like there's an embodiment of the experience and of Ubuntu itself, and I think contemporary artists, that embodiment, they've done it fairly well, and that's because of the shifts in kind of art practice, performance art being accepted as a form of visual arts expression. That has also helped in the artists kind of inserting their own bodies within the art making process. And I think that then brings about another kind of heightened sense of humanity, kind of an aesthetic humanity that is taking place within the art making process. So yes, I think one can certainly, for a future project, kind of trace that trajectory.
One other path you might explore, it seems to me it's interesting that so many of these pieces have been taken from the Bongi Blum
collection, yeah.
Of the Javits Foundation. So
Yeah.
really, you know, what is institutionalized that particular selection of projects that go into that collection and that foundation, because then that perpetuates certain barriers about what is included, excluded.
And thank you for bringing that up, because in many ways, so the kind of pragmatic decisions as to why Bongi Dlomo collection, and also kind of thinking ahead that if this is kind of publishable material, I'm kind of in with the foundation there, so I can get approval much easier to use the images. But also the part, and I think it goes back to the question around female agency. Bongi Dlomo is one of the most important black female artists of the 20th century, and she has been commissioned by the Javits Foundation to kind of put together this collection of 20th century black art. And for me it was quite interesting that when I looked at most of the images that she had selected, this Ubuntu aesthetic comes through. So I think that there is something there in that collection itself. What is it about her choices of putting these works together that lends itself to this kind of reading? Would I have been able to do the same reading with the Rupert collection? It becomes a question. Who knows? But it seems that her choices of 20th century art, which does include black female artists, lends itself to this kind of reading.
So, Pfunzo, I wanted to bring in some of the discussions that came out from the virtual student dialogues when they were discussing Ubuntu. And one of the issues that they talked about quite a bit was the fact that Ubuntu is talked about as this collective humanity, yet it comes along also with these identity labels that are exclusive. So when we talk about black, these are labels that are not inclusive of every human. They are exclusive. And how do these sit together? Like, how do we talk about Ubuntu and then talk about black, African, or South African, or woman, or these are exclusive labels. In addition to that, these labels were inscribed on people.
That's right.
These are not like labels that people created and said, I am this, I am this. People are being labeled this. So how do we embrace these labels? Why do we embrace them? And how do they sit together with Ubuntu as even collective humanity?
That's a great question, and I couldn't agree more with those critiques. That if Ubuntu is generally about humanity, then obviously it should transcend all categories, right? In fact, we shouldn't even be calling it African, in fact, right? And that it almost becomes self-defeating. If Ubuntu is about humanity, then why should it be about African exceptionalism? I would imagine that the answer goes back to it being part of a political strategy, and that is really one can't move away from that. In fact, one of my former colleagues, Lance Nauer, a really interesting thinker. We had one of the dialogues, I think, around. It was indigenous knowledge systems and so on, and then Ubuntu came up, and then he actually said, well, as a strategy of war, he thinks that Ubuntu was probably the best strategy that the oppressors used or deployed on the kind of colonized subjects. Because what it did is, if you quote unquote ascribe this Ubuntu or form of humanity, then it squashes any kind of revolution or violence or backlash, because hey, if you guys are generally beings of Ubuntu, then you can't take up arms, right? You need to forgive, and so seeing it as being something that itself was imposed, that this is actually not something that is inherently African, that it came from the West. And he made a compelling case, saying that the first time that Ubuntu actually comes out in literature, it's not being used by Africans, right? It's actually being used by European writers. That's the first time that it kind of comes through in academic texts, and then later on it's kind of appropriated by African scholars, and that for me was quite radical. So okay, and it lends itself to that, like these categories, where are they coming from, and even this notion itself, if we look at its genealogy, when was it first used, and who was using it, and why was it being used, and why was it being ascribed to a particular grouping, and I say it comes back to also political questions.
Based on that, I also wanted to add that Ubuntu is as old as the African people. It doesn't have to have been written to have given existence. The principle still remains, whether it's labeled by a performative of that. And it doesn't, you cannot, it applies in the community across the different populations. We still have women, and we have the old, we have men, we have children, we have young people. But the principle of Ubuntu connects them in the way we live our lives. So when societies change, especially US North Africa suffered a lot through colonialism, through other external forces, and some from within. Still Ubuntu is what remains. And even they were embracing peoples from elsewhere, it was under through the principle of Ubuntu. It was abused. It doesn't mean that when Ubuntu does exist, we don't even have other things going on. But that's what makes the African an African. And black is not, the labels are not African.
They're
when
not.
we had equivalent labels, it didn't mean that they moved Ubuntu from binding the African people. So white, black, these are concepts which are forced on Africans, and still I'm happy that Ubuntu still persists. It bonds the African people, whether in Brazil or in Michigan or in South Africa.
Amen.
I just wanted to agree with him in terms of that the concept that existed as a collective, and it's beyond that. I think you spoke about when Mark was asking about the candles. I mean, he alludes to the idea of seriti, but seriti goes beyond that. Like you can say to someone, like it's a very spiritual out of body experience. So in Mutu, you have like humanity Mutu as a person. But when you have Siriti, Mutuona Siriti, it's beyond, it's a recognition of your presence as a human being when you arrive into an office or whatever, as a sense of human, of your presence, in that you still have something that exists beyond yourself, and others can recognize it outside yourself as an individual. Then comes the collective part of it, Ubuntu, whatever, that connects both as an individual, Seriti, somewhat as an individual, and the collective part of it that links it together. And I think those principles always goes, I mean, the art and so on, like links those two things together. And I think sometimes when these whole debates about the philosophies of Ubuntu, whether they exist or not, I think we forget it, like the essence of what it is, the presence of the everyday, the material sense, but also something beyond that connects you to the world. and the universe in itself that actually, I think, the oppressed or the people from the South in general have outside. I think when you come to America, it reminds you how much those very presence of it doesn't actually exist in many levels here, and especially in Europe, where I think when you go to India or the South or Latin America, there's a collectiveness that binds that together. And I think we shouldn't forget that as people of the southern part of the quote unquote, of course, that actually links that keeps the heritage, I think, going, that is outside Europe, that you would never understand it in the very sense of like even relating to someone. And it goes into these levels, not the motu, but there's something else, which is beyond just motu, which reminds you, grounds you, but also transcends you as a person. And I think, sometimes, the written form, of course, will come from the West in terms of that, but the essence of it is beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think we see it in the arts. The candle is such a symbolic part of, even in that poverty, as an individual.
Have a humanity.
In multiple forms of that.
Yeah. Another example. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I think Isaac had it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of the term Ubuntu, the concept itself, I want to echo that yes, in our African culture, that is something that existed for centuries before even European encounter. In fact, the way in which Africans encountered Europeans in the first place was in Ubuntu. They met Europeans in a good way. They welcomed them, they shared places, they took them as,
other humans.
As brothers, as their humans, as part of humans. So the labeling is not African. That's exactly right. We didn't put those labels on them. The second part is the idea that Ubuntu was something that necessarily was labeled by the labelers and was imposed on us. I'm not so sure even in the literature, in the historiography of this concept, that necessarily started from the West. And I could be wrong, but the earliest appearance of this concept that I'm aware of is by Steinleck Samkange. I don't know if you've seen that small...
Yeah, I know the Samkange, the Zimbabwean...
that was in the 50s, where he talks about Hunu and Hunu. That's the first time I ever heard of it.
Yeah.
And then...
I think it comes later in the 80s. Some Kanges were published in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, certainly...
The original manuscript, I think,
was it in 50s? Okay. But yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So this concept existed, way before. And even in the literature, I think it was much earlier.
Yeah. Just quickly, if you could go back to the Dumile.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an amazing, it does speak to all these complex images of South-South solidarity, but also to some of the gender questions we've been discussing. Right? So there's a signaling, of course, to both West African and Central African masquerade.
Yeah, he does do it, yeah.
But also, I mean, although the primary face might be read as male, there is a sense perhaps in the lower half of not just an individual, but almost a collective sense of pregnancy, of rebirth. Of prison again is the site of the rebirth of the nation, one could argue, and maybe even a signals of the shape of Mother Africa herself, almost hovering around in that spectral way. I'm not sure, but there's some sense of possibility of a world that is yet to be born. And so that does seem to resonate with so much of the exploration of carceral space, of the prison as a space, not simply of isolation, but of the discovery of interconnectivity and of rebirth. Yeah.
So everything that has been said, especially Musa, I could not agree with you more. That's why I was drawn so much to the text by Seto Loane, where he engages with Sirite, because I think outside of understanding it through a kind of spiritual lens, it will be really difficult to engage with Ubuntu, okay, and how it functions on a very basic level. And yes, you are right that the kind of engagement between Africans and the West or the rest was predicated on Ubuntu. So my focus, obviously, on the urban space, besides it being linked to my PhD is this transition to what we consider kind of a modern African society, right? So as the urban space kind of being paradigmatic of like a modern existence. But even then, that kind of confrontation with the urban space, there was a lot of Ubuntu goodwill amongst black people that even if you think of the sacrifices that happened within the mines of, for example, the Royal Bafokeng, King Mokgatle, this is late 19th century, right? And late 19th century, asks his people, the men of the Bafokeng, to go work in the mines in Kimberley, which were highly exploitative. Many of them lost their lives. But says, go work because this is a necessary transition that we need to kind of undergo in order to revitalize our peoples within this modern paradigm, as disingenuous as it was. So again, you can see that kind of goodwill engagement, that we will go and we'll make you rich, this capitalists, and they did, made them these barons of the rand, as it became known, Johannesburg, fastest growing economy, and so on. But that was on the back of sacrifices by black men and the leaders of those who, again, one can read into this kind of a humanity, a collective humanity that was playing out there.
So it occurs to me, I don't know if it's there, but we have to look at other work, but there is a reading that this is not only the prison cell, but is also going down into the shaft.
The shaft.
Right?
Yeah,
which is, again,
that those
which
was
is often in Bella, right?
Yeah.
Especially for Basutu poets. It's a place of rebirth, right? You go into this compressed space as the shaft sinker.
That's right.
And then you come out something else. So maybe they're holding on as they're going back.
That's right. And that goodwill, for the most part, even still exists right now. If you check most of the debates around the labor disputes, they're not calling for a complete shutdown of the mining industry. It's just like, let there be like a humanity in how you engage. We will work in the mines, but just compensate us fairly, right? So again, kind of Ubuntu is at play there.
Of course, in mining organizations was that what they were struggling for was money with dignity.
There we go. That's it. So just acknowledge our humanity. So what then happens is the Royal Bafokeng then use the proceeds from that money to kind of barter with Kruger, at that time President Kruger, to buy up some farmland, because that's the first thing that he wanted to secure for his people was land, and this was before the Land Act of 1913 is enacted. But to cut the long story short, is then how they become the wealthiest monarch on the continent. Is platinum is discovered there, right, in the 1920s and mined by the British, and then it was in the 90s, I think, that they managed to get the rights for that and got back payments and became so wealthy. But it was on the back of those sacrifices that the man made to go to the mines, to give up their lives for the most part. But again, kind of humanity was at play even in that context, like even in the engagement with this problematic, bigoted urban space, industrial space that did not accord them any humanity.
I had a question, Pfunzo, that actually leads into that, and just I love reading your paper, and I really enjoyed seeing the images. And one of the things that you said that we've been repeating is how Ubuntu isn't a condition. It's not something that you just inherit passively. It needs to be practiced and embodied and acted. And it reminds me a little bit of Sharif Keita, our visitor last week, who's from Mali, and he talks about the praise poem, which is an exhortation to go beyond your name, that you're given your Sunjata, your Keita, but you can't rest on that. When you step out into the world and make your own your own identity, then that's kind of your calling, is to live up to that thing that you've been given through your
Sure.
lineage. And I feel
Sure.
like this enactment and practice is just a really compelling way to express this. And then my question really is about this idea of modernity as being urban, because from what I understand about 20th century South Africa after the Land Act and with the mining, that the urban and the rural are a kind of co-constituted modernity. That there's a kind of a loss almost of those that are kind of forcibly removed from the land, and the land is a place of such significance. And I guess my question is, because I was also wanting to know kind of what you're writing against. You're writing against the idea of Ubuntu in Afrophilia or some of those other kinds of Ubuntu, but it seems like, is there an understanding you're writing against that Ubuntu belongs in the countryside, in the village? So finding it in the town is a surprise, or that we wouldn't expect to find it there. Is that what you're, I'm wondering about this dichotomy that modernity is only urban and then rural is not linked to the urban modernity.
So actually, one of the now this goes back to one of the aims of the dissertation itself is to unsettle those binaries between the urban and the rural, right? And of course, if we extend that to thinking about Ubuntu, then obviously, if this is a prototypically African expression of being, then it can only exist in a non-modern, and non-modern I mean non-Western setting, right? Because that's where Africans could be themselves untouched, untainted by civilization, quote unquote. But no, we have to think of it, and one of the foundational texts that I look at, we need to think of Ubuntu as a modern construct. So how can we think of it in modern terms? And of course, the urban space is our gateway to this modern context. So, but again, that's not to say that one should think of it as a kind of a dialectical, that there was the rural and then there was the urban, but it's just to break those binaries that still in many ways persist today as well in our thinking of the urban environment, the rural, the modern, the backward, and so on. These are really problematic dynamics, but certainly my aim is to think of the African within a modern urban context, and how vibrant that is.
A little bit reminds me of, because these images are all from the 50s and 60s when, intellectuals like Julius Nyerere were kind of imagining Ujamaa as another kind of concept, but it was all about the rural. And he was actually taking youth out of the cities and moving them to settlement villages to embody into this rural practice. So that's something I'm familiar with as well, that the city was meant to be a place without humanity, and that people were getting corrupted and vice was there and so on. So there are patterns in Pan-Africanism, I think, of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. Native Nostalgia by Jacob Dlamini is a fascinating text, and it received its due adulation and also its critique, right? Where some people said, I think he published this in 2009, where he was writing also in very kind of subjective terms, and he did interviews of people that thought of apartheid in nostalgic ways, right? And there was that criticism of how can you think of such a horrific history in this way, and how can you celebrate? But the fact is, life still happened within those bigoted urban spaces. Ubuntu still happened within those crime-ridden contexts. That's just the reality of it. Of course, it's unpopular to say things like that, but that is the truth that we cannot get away from, that we cannot deny. And it's kind of easy, and I think that's one of the kind of dominant narratives that apartheid was all bad, was all evil, nothing good came from it, and slightly not the case.
Really erase a whole century
of life and humanity that was taking place. Oh, great.
Other questions or comments?
I just wanted to add that as an ethnomusicologist, what you're doing with art is these are very similar questions that I pursue with music. So in the context of South Africa, take the music of the Soul Brothers, for example, and what it depicts about African culture, African values, the use of proverbs, the descriptive nature of experiences, whether from the female side or from the male side. Several songs sung by the Soul Brothers depict that Ubuntu, it's a performance of Ubuntu in song.
Sure.
So there are parallels with art.
Yeah, that's one of my concluding remarks is just not artists, but it can be applied to other artists. Yeah, music, drama, the theater, literature. I think there's a whole repository where you can find that kind of performative recording of how Ubuntu was active and at play.
To Rosa's point, you can extend that to the Caribbean, to Latin America.
The black world.
Extend that. Africa Unite, all these things. They come together.
Well, this was remarkable. What
thank
a
you.
rich paper, what a wonderful conversation, and you're still standing after a 3-day trip.
No.
You're really amazing. And
thank you. No, this was awesome. Thank you for your input.
And we'll be together for